Good evening to all our audiences in South Asia. I'm Pragya Narang, a peace activist and communication specialist. And to all of our audiences who are joining from time zones in the West, I hope you're having a bright morning today. Welcome to session 4 of South Asia's Union Summit led by women. In this session titled Voice and Vulnerability, Women Activists in Times of Conflict, our panelists shall discuss the challenges of women who stand up for peace and justice in conflict zones and patriarchal societies that are typical of South Asia. It is my honor to introduce our panelists for this session. We have with us Hina Jilani ji, pioneering lawyer and pro-democracy advocate from Pakistan, a human rights activist. She served as the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Human Rights Defenders. She is also the co-founder of Pakistan's first all-female legal aid practice, AGHS Legal Aid Cell, in Lahore, along with her sister, the much-loved South Asian, late Asma Jahangir-ji. She was one of the founders of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan and Women's Action Forum. She holds an honorary doctorate from Trinity College, Dublin. Welcome, Hina ji. Our next panelist is Ambika Satkunanathan, also an advocate and the former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Armed with a BA and LLB from Monash University in Australia and an LLM from the University of Nottingham, she specializes in human rights. One of her biggest accolades was leading the first ever national study of prison in Sri Lanka. The study resulted in a detailed and comprehensive documentation of the state of prisons as well as the plight of those in prison. She has also been a Chevening Scholar in the past and currently serves as the chairperson of Neelan Tiruchevalam Trust. Thank you for joining us, Ambika. We also have Veena Sikri ji, who has served as the former Indian High Commissioner to Bangladesh and Malaysia. She is the founder and convener of SWAN, which is South Asia Women's Network. She is the Ford Foundation Endowed Chair for the Bangladesh Studies Program at Academy of International Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and All India rank holder #1 in the prestigious UPSC exams. She has served her diplomatic missions in Moscow, New York, Kathmandu, and Paris. In her own words, it was the plight of women in South Asia she witnessed during her stints in Bangladesh and Nepal that called to her and pulled her into activism for women's equality, respect, and dignity. We are glad to have you, Veena ji. The panel shall be moderated by Archana Chaudhary, who is a journalist with Bloomberg in India for the past 15 years. Archana is a 3-time recipient of the SOPA Award for Excellence in reporting on women's issues. We thank our panelists for joining us today and would like to remind our audiences that the hashtags we are using for the summit are hashtag South Asia Union, hashtag SAUS 2021, hashtag South Asia Peace, and hashtag Women for Peace. With that, I hand it over to you, Archana.
Thank you. Thank you so much and welcome all of you. It's a privilege and an honor to be sitting here and talking to all of you with all the stellar work that you all have done on women's issues and human rights. I will not take much time. Let's go straight to Ms. Satkunanathan. Ambika ji, we'd like to start with you first. Let's head straight into what your personal experience has been and how civil war and strife that has affected lives in Sri Lanka, not just women, and also in South Asia, across South Asia. If you'd like to speak about your personal moment of epiphany as a woman that convinced you that you need to step into this and do something.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think what spurred my activism and advocacy in human rights, I think, was also my identity, my ethnic identity, and experiencing violence and discrimination. Therefore, I think when we speak of women's activism, we need to take an intersectional approach. And this is important because women face multiple obstacles, multiple forms of inequality as they struggle for the rights, their own rights, as well as the rights of their community. What do I mean? So for instance, if we take, let's say, Sri Lanka and the conflict-affected areas, there are women who are families of the disappeared, who are searching for their disappeared family member. So as they do so, they challenge the state and they are subject to surveillance, harassment, etc. At the same time, the fact that they are Tamil women places them at increased risk, because they do their activism in the context also of militarization. So there are multiple forms of inequality and different forms of violence that they may be vulnerable to. And I think this is very important, because even if we take other parts of South Asia, like for instance in India, Dalit women, so while they face the structural inequalities, they also face inequalities within their own communities and societies in the form of gender discrimination and violence. If I take the example of the women who are searching for the disappeared in Sri Lanka, they have also said that they face struggles within their own community, because people say, why are you constantly on the streets? Why are you within their families? Why is it that they are spending so much time in these demonstrations? So they face multiple forms of discrimination and violence, which is why I think when we speak of women's activism, there are some of us who might be more privileged, and that privilege might protect us from some forms of these discrimination. Hence, I think it is important for us to be aware of this privilege and to check our own privilege, to ensure that we open up these spaces and we don't also function as gatekeepers, and we ensure that we assist in dismantling these multiple forms of inequalities and discrimination that they face, instead of reproducing them.
That's a fair point. Is there a point where was there, to come back to my question on a personal epiphany, a point where you stood up and you said, this is where I'm needed, where you decided to put your weight behind, helping women who are facing and standing up to these challenges?
Well, I don't know. I think it might be when I was, age 9, and we faced violence, the ethnic riots, and we had to flee, and we had to jump over walls, and we had to live in an IDP camp for a few weeks, and then go by ship to another part of the country for safety. And I think that incident is probably what had a huge impact on me. And then, of course, being a Tamil woman, as I said, there are multiple forms of discrimination, but at the same time, I'm well aware of the privilege I have that protected me from some of it.
Yeah. That is an excellent point, to check your own privilege, to realize that we are in a place where we can actually help and to actually do that. Which takes me to Ms. Jilani, and because when we've talked about ethnic violence, we've talked about how that has affected, or discrimination that comes in, that women have to face in Sri Lanka. We're also seeing a trend in South Asia, and Pakistan has witnessed this also, the rise of religious conservatism, and how that has affected the subcontinent, especially over the last 3-4 decades, because a generation of women talk about a different kind of dream that we had for South Asia. And your generation has dreamt that dream. And yet we have seen since the 1980s a change, a pattern that is taking us back towards more conservative, a more conservative world. If you could speak about how that has affected and challenged women's rights movement, that at some point we thought that we were going to make it much faster than we are in the direction we are headed to.
Yes, I think, Archana, you really laid your finger on the right point here, and used Pakistan as the most appropriate example of what you're asking about. I would, however, say that it's not just religious extremism that we have confronted. And to say that it is conservatism is a euphemism. What we are looking at is growing religious extremism that has in fact allowed more and more authoritarianism in this region. So that worries me as well. It's not just religion-based extremism, but also what is accompanying this trend is a rise in authoritarianism and more tolerance for that authoritarianism, despite the fact that all South Asian countries claim to be democratic countries and have constitutional rule in their countries. And of course, in most of the constitutions that I am familiar with, in all the 8 South Asian countries, equality and non-discrimination are fundamental rights that are acknowledged and recognized. Yet, how much are they willing to concede to these rights when there is a state sponsor? In all these countries, I think the trend of religious extremism, in many ways, is because of governments, not because of any efforts on their part to arrest these trends. So this is, I think, the situation that we confronted in the 1980s in Pakistan. And much of what was happening was not because of a domestic agenda of the military regime that had taken over in 1977 after hanging a popularly elected prime minister in this country. They went ahead to take forward their agenda of defense and of their relationship within the region and the country of the region. So you remember what was happening in Afghanistan at that time. Pakistan's position at that time was very clear. A lot of what was happening in Pakistan in terms of Islamization of laws and the enforcement of policies of religious extremism and insistence that the population submit to state-controlled religion was because they wanted that what they were wanting to support in Afghanistan should have acceptance in Pakistan. And this is where I think I can say that the women's movement, that is the more kind of modern women's movement and more recent women's movement, took shape. Because this was a movement for resistance. Earlier on, I think there was a women's movement in Pakistan always, and there had been spurts of demands that had come from the women's groups on improvement on women's social status or their legal status. But every time we saw something happening, it was never as a negative thing. We were making very small steps forward, but at least these were steps forward. What we saw in the 1980s was a reinforcement of the very attitudes, whether they were at the social level or legislative lacunas that initiated discrimination, allowed women to have a lesser status, allowed discrimination, allowed tolerance for violence against women. So I think this was what gave rise to the Women's Action Forum. That was the first platform that formed as a resistance. Now, when we come to the situation that Ambika has just described, of course, there was not a live conflict in Pakistan at that time, but there was a very serious division and polarization in the country that had led to social conflict and that had led to a lot of violence. And that violence has continued for 4 decades now. And every time that we hold the state accountable or try to do so by saying that you are fostering trends of religious extremism by allowing influence of these so-called religious groups that are a small minority, but they have too much and disproportionate influence over state decisions and over institutions like the parliament. They hold the parliament hostage, they hold the judiciary hostage, and that ends up in women losing some of their status, non-Muslim minorities being made more vulnerable in this country. So then this whole question arose that even if there is not an active conflict, there are serious security concerns in this country that are linked to religious extremism. So who is now going to determine the security imperatives in this country? Women or the more vulnerable sections of the populations that are directly hit by the trends of religious extremism and the state failure to arrest that extremism. These are the sections of the population that don't have a seat at the table to decide on what our national security imperatives are and what the state does to us, to our rights, and to our safety and our dignity. In the name of security, we have we have no role in determining that. So when people talk to me about women and women in and peace and security, women in peace and security, we talk about the UN resolutions, etc., etc. I tell them, look, the UN resolutions are very positive, but understand them. What has in practical measures happened is that the women's role is relegated now to looking after IDPs or refugees. I feel very good when I am called upon to help these sections of the populations, but this is not what empowers me. What empowers me as a woman and where I want to sit is at the table where I am able to tell what our security imperatives are. And I'm not going to wait for our military or our intelligence community to tell us what our security imperatives are, and then to craft whether it's a external policy, whether it's domestic policy, whether it's policy to curb religious extremism, religious based terrorism that is hurting women. Today I see a surge again. We have spent 30 years fighting what Ziaul Haq had done, and did have some very significant successes in the later periods.
Yeah.
Now what has happened in Afghanistan is pushing us again back in the same situation. That's why I'm very keen that this is one trend that is common to South Asia and needs a South Asian movement which is strong enough to put pressure on our respective governments and pressurize the international community to see South Asia from the lens of the civil society here and what is hitting the civil society as a whole and the more vulnerable sections that the civil society is trying to protect.
That's an excellent point, Ms. Jilani. To be able to hold the government accountable and to be able to have more space where we are crafting a bigger space, a larger space, a bigger say in how things are run in our respective countries. And I think our next guest, Ms. Sikri, Ambassador Sikri has a extensive experience in precisely understanding how these power structures in the government work. So we'd like to turn to you next, Ms. Sikri. What have been the experiences when it comes to experiences of women in power structures and bureaucracy? How have things changed? Because your generation was the generation that broke the glass ceiling. South Asian women like us looked up to you, looked up and said, okay, this was possible. There are so many IFS women now, foreign services, women who are participating, trying to run the country. But where have we gone forward? Where have we gone, where have we stepped back and what needs to change?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for the question. I do agree fully that the situation regarding women in South Asia is critical to the further development and progress in South Asia. And I say it for a specific reason. You're right that when at the time when I joined the Foreign Service, way back in 71, it was a very, very interesting and important time in the sense that at that time, almost 25 years after India got independence, our constitutional systems were well in place. And on paper, you could say that, yes, there is equality and, women can, everything was by competition. So there was the UPSC exam and anybody could appear for it. It was completely free and well assessed and equally assessed exam. So I joined the Foreign Service. But then gradually, as being in the Foreign Service, one came across a lot of rules and regulations within the service that mitigated against this equality. For example, even at the very beginning, there was a rule that married women could not join the Indian Foreign Service. Now, why this rule should be there? Because married men could join, but it just was there. And I know many senior colleagues who could not join the Foreign Service because they were married. So this was the first rule to fight against. And when a woman wanted to get married, she had to apply for permission to get married. A man did not have to apply for permission to get married. He just informed and that was it. So these were the initial factors we fought against. Then, for example, when we went abroad on my first posting, my husband was also in the Foreign Service. So we were two diplomats posted in the same mission. But the salary structure was different for a married woman and for the man. So that was a very long and detailed struggle to get equality of pay for men and women, equality of pay and allowances for men and women. So these were the battles that we fought during the service time. Now, having gone through these battles and overcome them and successfully helped all succeeding generations of women Foreign Service officers, what did strike me, and it dawned on me in a stronger and stronger way as I grew more senior and spent a lot of time in South Asia during my career. I was in Nepal. I was posted as High Commissioner to Bangladesh. I've worked on many SAARC summits. I've worked on an online movement. So all these things brought out to me that just having the constitutional provisions is not enough. And then I found that in South Asia, there is another huge problem. Individual women are strong in South Asia. It's amazing that in terms of heads of government and heads of state, South Asia is perhaps the most advanced region in the world for women, because we've had presidents and prime ministers in India, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, and in Bangladesh even today. So it has been one of those areas where people say, wow, women have reached the highest positions and they've broken every glass ceiling there is. But when you look into it deeper, what does it show? Women at the grassroots level face tremendous problems. There's a patriarchal system in place that mitigates against equality and justice and a non-discriminatory regime for women. So in fact, that is the purpose with which I started a South Asia Women's Network. Once I retired from government service and I joined Jamia Millia Islamia, that is where actually the South Asia Women's Network was born. And Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus came to inaugurate it in 2009. And now we are in the 12th year of our existence. And this is exactly what we have done. We have worked on many areas, we've worked on many projects, and then we have come to a very strong conclusion, two strong conclusions, I will say. One is the importance of changing mindsets. This is critical. If we don't change mindsets against women, we don't change the prevalent mindset against women, which the patriarchal mindset mitigates against equality, which gives them discrimination, the threat of violence, all this brings in terrible things. This is the first battle that we have to struggle against, changing mindsets. And the second one is that for economic development, for sustainable development in South Asia, until you put women at the center of the process, you are not going to be able to achieve the sustainable development goals. So our struggle is for sustainable development through gender empowerment of the women of South Asia. We are fighting to achieve the SDGs, but we want to do it by bringing women in the central focus. Women's agency, leadership, participation, this is vital in areas, whether it is the environment, whether it is malnutrition, whether it is equality in education, every area you look at, this is what is vital. And this is what my group SWAN is battling for and working for. So we are working in different areas on these issues, like changing mindsets and bringing women into the development factor to achieve the sustainable development goals for South Asia.
So again, it's the same in terms of ensuring that women have more space. They get.
I can't hear. Sorry, I can't hear the.
Say in how things are.
No, there's something wrong with the sound. I can't hear.
Just, I think it's raining here.
Oh.
It's raining here, so I think that's affected the network. Can you hear me at all?
Yeah, now I can, a little bit better, yes.
Okay. I was saying that the theme remains the same in terms of needing to have women have more say in how things are run in South Asia, whether it is within the power structures or outside it, in the society. Which brings me to my question to all of you, and I'd like to come back to you, Ms. Ambika ji, if that's okay. In terms of how the rising authoritarianism in leadership like Ms. Jilani said so correctly, we're seeing an increase in authoritarianism, less say in terms of who has, how our governments are run for the people, because that is one of the things that democracy, the spaces for democracy seem to be shrinking. How is it affecting women's lives in your experience?
I think, yes, rising authoritarianism in the region and looking to the strong man and ethno-nationalist politics. I think we see that all over the region, particularly in Sri Lanka. And for those of us in Sri Lanka, I think we look particularly to India for a long time as an inspiration, particularly your courts. But of course, now we see very worrying developments the past few years. But what is very interesting is that the strategies used by all these strong men appear to be quite the same. It's like they're using the same playbook. So then I wonder about us, human rights activists in the region. And I think, as Ms. Jilani said initially, I think what we need is also a more coordinated way of fighting against the rising authoritarianism, because ethno-nationalist politics, as we have seen, has had corrosive impact on rights, national security, and how it is conceived. It is viewed in a very narrow way, and it is weaponized against minorities, against dissenters, and particularly human rights activists. National security is used to also crack down on NGOs through laws and other means. We see that throughout the region. So in that context, we also see, for instance, it's a very militarized policing, militarization of policing, even militarization of the penal system we see in Sri Lanka increasingly. So these are some of the common factors I think we see all over the region. National sovereignty, of course, is what is used by these authoritarian leaders to say that, international mechanisms such as the UN Human Rights Council or special rapporteurs cannot and should not intervene. The very interesting thing about national sovereignty is that it comes into play only when you speak of human rights. Sovereignty in relation to massive, soft loans at outrageous interest rates, all sorts of financial dealings with other authoritarian states. I mean, China's role in the region, particularly in Sri Lanka as well. At that point, sovereignty is not spoken of. We have a port city, which they tried to bring up under come up with a separate set of laws even for that. So what about national sovereignty at that point? So it's an interesting concept, but I think we as human rights defenders also need to be more sophisticated perhaps in how we battle this, because it's not easy. We also have social media, and what we see all over the region, not just the region, even the globe, about how these authoritarian leaders, we saw it in Myanmar, we saw it in Sri Lanka, how they used social media to incite hatred against social groups, ethnic groups, and how they use it to incite violence, how the large corporates are often, a hand in glove with these authoritarian states and submitting to their very unreasonable demands that violate human rights and violates privacy. So I think that is a problem facing not just actually the region. If you look at this pattern, you see it globally, and that is very worrying, because we see also erosion of the rights framework that we have built, even internationally at the Human Rights Council and other bodies. We see these politics at play, which is having an adverse impact on the protection of human rights. So I would say, as Ms. Jilani said, we just need to also regionally come together, be more effective, coordinate, collaborate more, and perhaps become more sophisticated also in how we fight back against this.
That's interesting. Ms. Jilani, would you like to add to that in terms of, because it's a fabulous idea to be able to pool our resources together to raise our voices. Would you like to elaborate on how that can be done?
I think I agree 100% with what Ambika has said and the way she has analyzed the various trends that we all commonly experience in this region. But one point on national sovereignty, I think we must all now understand that the whole concept of national sovereignty becomes rather controversial and meaningless for the people when you are living in states where somehow the interest of the state now conflicts with the interest of the people. And this is what worries me, that a lot of us have still not realized that the state has taken on its own shape and identity separately from the people, and they don't realize that when we talk about national sovereignty or the state, it's actually the people that we are talking about. But now the people have become minors. All our constitutions start with "we the people," but somewhere we have got lost, and the state has taken on a much bigger prominence and in some ways conflicts with our interests as far as our socioeconomic rights are concerned, our cultural rights are concerned, or even our political rights are concerned. So one thing is that the civil society in this region has to now reframe the whole concept of national sovereignty so that our leaders are unable now to use these justifications, whether it's Asian values that they use or national sovereignty that they use. These are not things that we should allow them to do anymore. Just one more point on this whole question of where are we going now as the civil society and how are women suffering. Look, as commitment to democracy, democratic values wanes in this region, women's problems become more complicated, but also more serious. Because it's not just an individual woman now who is concerned, but women as a population at risk in these countries now have to take on a very different identity. We are not just individual women anymore. We are in our societies now, as I said, everyone individually and collectively is at risk. So we have to strategize our security, both in the home and in the public domain. So these strategies have now to become a part of our activism as women's rights activists or human rights activists. The tragedy that we are facing now is you don't value democracy anymore in these countries. There are no institutions that are willing to uphold democracy. In Pakistan, every martial law has been sanctified by our Supreme Court and given legal status, every martial law. But at the same time, this Supreme Court has taken suo motu action against elected prime ministers just to oust them and to say that they no longer enjoy the ability. They don't have the ability to govern when they are elected prime ministers. Them they have ousted. Military dictators they could never oust. So who's going to stand up for my right as a woman when I'm standing up in the face of these very extremist groups that are holding the whole population at hostage? Even the state is now hostage to their demands. Judges don't want to, judges want to appease them. The parliaments want to appease them. Child marriage laws never get passed in our parliaments because the mullahs raise a hoo-ha. So these are, I'm just talking about my country, but I'm sure in the different contexts, the same applies to all yours. These are some of the issues I think we as civil society and women in the civil society in particular, in the human rights community, need to think about and, in fact, now coerce the human rights movement to take this challenge on head on now.
It's a perfectly valid demand, I think, to say that we need to ensure that democracy is valued more and that the rights of citizens are upheld. to that extent, how can women in governments and women who, like the first point that Ms. Ambika had made in terms of the privilege that we hold, the privilege that we have as those who can see what's coming and what's happening. Uh, would you like to weigh in here, Ambassador Sikri, and talk about how women in government are doing things to change, examples that you're seeing, or how this can be done by women who have, how do we need to step up? How do those in power need to step up?
Yeah, I think this is no doubt a very important aspect, but I have a very, very clear issue on this, that we should not politicize every issue that happens. Now, what the problem is occurring, whatever may be the feeling now in India, let me talk about India. I think that, we do have a very active judiciary. We do have a very active executive. We do have a very active legislature. We have a very, very active media. And we have a lot of groups all over. And in addition to that, we have a very strong federal structure, so that you do have elections taking place not only at the center, but you have the elections taking place in the state governments, and sometimes different parties win, and very often different parties win and all that. Now, the point is that this structure must be preserved. I do not believe in calling for destruction of structures just for the sake of destruction, because we have seen in countries like former Soviet Union and others where this can lead to complete chaos. So I think that calling for opposition on issues of human rights and on issues of gender in the guise of political opposition to the government in power, this is very destructive of the norms of a society. I think issue by issue, each concern should be taken up. And each concern should be taken up in all existing structures, whether it is the judiciary, whether it is through the media, whether it is through parliament. But do not use the very important aspect of debating these issues to always bring in a political opposition to who's in power. Because the moment you do that, you're going to invite a polarization. And a polarization in society is very destructive of achieving objectives. Now, if you have, even let's take the women's issues, and I can say that every woman is committed to women's equality, lack of no discrimination, and empowerment. This is there. Now, but if you're going to use the women's issues to divide people who are maybe pro one government or against one government, and say, this is bad, whatever this government says is bad, everything must be opposed, this is not going to lead you anywhere. This is not going to lead to a constructive solution. I believe in a constructive solution, not in a destructive approach. Now, I think that we have to do that, whether it do through peaceful, debates, peaceful demonstrations, debating a society, debating an issue openly. Now, if you go to a judiciary in India, I think we have a very strong judiciary, a judiciary that has shown its independence on more than one occasion. And but if you go to the judiciary and the judiciary gives a verdict, if somebody doesn't like the word, you oppose it on different grounds. So these are the kind of aspects that we have to be very careful about. The issues are very important and the issues need to be taken up. But how are we going to do it? This is something it has to be done through a very careful coming together across the political spectrum. Don't take up issues which are based on polarization according to the political spectrum, because these kind of, if you take it up on those bases, you will not get any result. You will only have further polarization and destruction in society. And I think that there are many examples of this in many countries all over the world, not just in South Asia. So I think on the other hand, when you take up, for example, economic issues, now economic issues are very strong, and if you work for the economic empowerment of women, I can tell you that's a great starting point. And that economic empowerment leads to the women being full of strength and energy to fight on every cause. Like we have in the panchayat, you have even women who've been given 1/3 leadership of all panchayats in the country. Now that's very valuable. And you see the women there who are doing good work on, whether it's on health, on nutrition, on education, on building infrastructure in the villages. All these issues are being taken up with great strength and vigor. So let's say that, all right, let's do it through the economic angle. Can any government oppose it on that? No. There are many government programs which are there, and ask for their implementation. Ask for their completely equal implementation without any discrimination on any grounds whatsoever. whether it is on, gender or ethnicity or caste or religion. And that is the way to move ahead. So the moment you have non-discriminatory implementation, non-discriminatory application of all laws where everybody feels benefited. If you have an economic, during COVID, we've had so many wonderful schemes, to help the migrant workers, to help people who've lost their jobs. And these are implemented on a completely non-discriminatory basis. That gives a lot of confidence that yes, this can be done, let's go ahead. So the moment you start building like that, you have women coming together, you have everybody coming together, regardless of whatever your political views may be. And you have to build these bricks of commonality, build the bricks of coming together, and not focus only on the bricks that will polarize you and divide you into different groups without achieving the objectives that you want to achieve. This is a very, very important aspect, and I think that polarization in society is not helpful at all. It's very easy to criticize, it's very easy to polarize. Building is what takes hard work. Coming together and keeping together is what takes hard work. So we have to work on that basis.
Yeah, fair point, Master Sikri. Agreed that building takes a lot, makes it a lot harder, but, and that debating and peaceful means are better. Be able to come, seem to come for more space for women's voices, and that it's time that women got together to be able to make themselves heard. And I think on that note, we should end this happy discussion. It's been an interesting and vigorous one. It's been in many ways a discussion that needs to happen more widely, and hopefully this is where it starts. Ms. Jilani, hopefully you've got us thinking in terms of how, the need to do this, to be able to come together and raise our voices, and hopefully that's where we'll head. So on that note, I'd like to thank all of you all. Thank you very much for making the time. We are coming to an end of our time, so thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hina ji just messaged that she wanted to respond. So, Veena ji, if you could just.
Sorry, I couldn't see that. My network is a little bad, so I couldn't see that bit. Could please come in, Ms. Jilani.
Just give me 1 second to just respond a little bit to some of the very important points that Veena has made. Now, let me just clarify very clearly that when I speak about civil society, I am in fact speaking about a civil society that knows very well that neither human rights nor women's rights can be promoted in isolation. I'm a human rights defender who firmly believes that if I'm unaware of the political context in which I'm trying to promote and protect human rights, I'm not doing any service to human rights at all. Secondly, polarization is not the work of the human rights community that believes in tolerance, that believes in diversity, that believes in freedom of expression, and promotes diversity rather than promotes polarization. Polarization, in fact, is the tool of the authoritarian leadership in our country. This is the tool through which they spread their influence and their control over our society. So civil society, in fact, should never be blamed for polarization. They fight against these trends of polarization. So these are only 2 or 3 things that I wanted to clarify.
That's a very, very fair point. And I agree. I think we all agree on that point, that it's not the civil society's job to not polarize people. It's not their bail. But thank you very much for that intervention. Thank you very much for clarifying. And we've run out of time. We're over our time. So we'll end the session here. Thank you so much for joining.
Well, this was such an enriching discussion. We heard voices from India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and I thank all our panelists for being here, and thank you, Archana, for being such a punctual moderator as well. And I would just like to remind our audiences that the next session starts in 14 minutes, so come back to our social media channel. And thank you so much. Thank you to the audiences as well for being there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.